know me. Some of you folks I think might not. So thank you all for coming today. Very, very happy to have you here. And it's my great pleasure to introduce to you our guest speaker today, Dr. DeLeon Gray. So Dr. Gray is an assistant professor of educational psychology at North Carolina State University. He runs the SMART Lab. So all your students are smart in your lab, I'm sure. He earned a PhD in Ed Psych from the Ohio State University. And his his BA is in interdisciplinary studies, which I didn't know. That was fun to read about you. From the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. He's also held a number of interesting appointments, and just to highlight a couple, at the Association for Psychological Sciences and the American Institutes for Research and the National Institutes of Health, and very curious about that. That's another thing I didn't know about your background, and so hopefully later we can find out more about that. Dr. Gray's research program examines how adolescents and emerging adults perceive and interpret their social encounters in achievement contexts. And his research investigates the role of social identity processes in achievement contexts, particularly in terms of students striving to stand out and fit in within their peer circles. He also examines students' judgments about socialization and the socializers, like teachers and parents and mentors, and how students interpret the messages from those socializers about their achievement. Obviously, a very, very important topic for our mission here in Rossero. He's won a number of awards, but I don't want to run out of time, so I'm just going to mention one. He's the recipient of the Rise Up Award, research on socially and economically underrepresented populations. And finally, according to his website, he likes karaoke. Another thing I learned about you, DeLeon, I've known him for years. I did not know you were a karaoke fan, and I'm just saying, New York at a year A, maybe we do a little karaoke.
I have my list.
His talk today is entitled, Why Should We Learn This? Providing Meaningful Opportunities for Students of Color. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Gray.
I'm going to dim the lights a little bit here.
Perfect.
Okay. So when I was visiting the University of Oregon, they had this class, this series, and Gail, I think you were there right before me. They started off the class by having people talk about things that what was on their mind that day. So for me, I wanted to start that off because I was reminded of that as I was running this morning around your neighborhood. And I came across this construction. I kept running down the street. It was at the intersection of Exposition in Wisconsin, so it was like kind of right here. And when I kept running, there were signs in the windows of these low-income communities where they were saying, look, stop. They're trying to get us to like move forcefully out of this neighborhood, and we don't want to go. And so I want to bring the community members here with me today, and that's what's on my mind as I'm giving this talk. And as I think about my work in belonging, I cannot help but to connect the idea of belonging in schools with belonging in society. Right? So this talk, although I don't mention the word belonging throughout this talk, it's weaved into my work so much so that it just serves as the conceptual backdrop to everything that I do. Now I want to bring you to Durham, North Carolina. All right? What you're looking at is a collage of images from this event called Black August in the Park. So every year in August, Black people get together to affirm their identities through fashion, through food, through music, through trivia. And the big idea here is we're all trying to just appreciate one another and have meaningful and substantive exchanges with one another. But through these exchanges, I got to see how much these people in Durham, North Carolina are rooting for me and my team to come up with innovative strategies to support students' motivation in schools. But it took me to a more fundamental question for myself. And that is, what does it mean for me to be a Black educational psychologist who's interested in the study of motivation? Do I believe that everything that students are learning in schools, is useful? for them and meaningful for them? And should they be learning everything that's put before them? So if I'm a motivation researcher and I come up with these strategies, are my strategies going to be used for good, right? And so that takes me to a place where I'm thinking a lot about curriculum and instruction and how it intersects with the psychological processes that I'm interested in studying. And so I want to talk to you today about this idea of communal utility value, which is an appreciation for when, where, and why academic content might be useful for serving one's community, serving one another, serving humanity. So what do I mean by serving one's community? I mean thinking about the people in one's community and thinking about how you can devote one's time and resources to take the skills that you're learning to benefit those in your neighborhood. By serving humanity, I mean preserving different forms of life, like plants, animals, and other human beings. And by serving one another, I really mean feeling a sense of responsibility for ways in which you can actually support individuals in the groups that you belong to, right? And so, with this in mind, I wanted to talk about some of the benefits of this idea of doing good, right? Or being other-focused. There's several benefits. People who do good tend to live longer. They have less anxiety and frustration. They're more likely to be more productive in their workplace. And they're more likely to add value to their workplace. But finally, the bonus is that they're more likely to want to do more good. And so there's so many outcomes that are related to this idea of doing good. I think sometimes that is lost and within the meta-narrative of motivation research. As we think about the students and what motivates them, other people can serve as a source of inspiration and motivation for us as well. And so I was fortunate to find this paper by Elizabeth Brown on the concept of communal utility value. And what she was trying to show is she had this really elegant set of interventions where she would have undergraduates read narratives of scientists who engaged in biomedical research. And they talked about the benefits of the research. Some of the research was high in communal utility value. Other ones did not necessarily focus on the communal benefits of the research. And what she found over several studies is that when the communal benefits were emphasized, students were more likely to see the relevance of that particular career, and they wanted to go into those careers. These samples were mostly women, mostly white students, but my research team got so excited when we said, okay, we're working in Durham, North Carolina, a lot of black and brown students in this place, middle school students. Let's see what it means to pare this down for middle schoolers. In our project, we have this project where we're trying to come up with developmentally supportive strategies for motivating students in STEM, particularly black and brown students in Durham. And so we work a lot with teachers, and we engage with the study of a different motivational construct each semester and really try to unpack that and collaborate with teachers. So they're our true collaborators in this process. So what I want to do is I want to give you a bit of a backdrop about this just by showing you a little bit about what the students were engaging in, and then we'll proceed with the talk. So here's a short clip for what we made for the teachers last semester.
Education to get a job. And education, you have to go through education to get your driver's license. Everything in this world has to do with education. That's why that's the most important issue.
Sorry, that song is my jam. So I don't know if anybody else knows the lyrics to that song or remembers that song, but that is my jam. So what they're doing is they're really engaging in electrical and computer engineering activities, but there's a why behind everything that they're doing, right? And that's what's privilege, and not the sake of doing STEM activities for just the sake of doing it, right? Or because we're trying to increase STEM interest. But I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But the guiding questions for today's talk are as follows. So the first question that we had is, what do teachers say about helping students recognize the communal purposes of scholastic activities? So rather than waiting until a results section to discuss this, we're really focusing on the idea of co-theorizing with the teachers, right? Their perspectives are valid and meaningful, and the only way that we're really going to understand what's going on in schools and make things actually like work for students is if we collaborate with them and see them as true partners. So you'll see their voices sprinkled throughout the talk, and I really want to highlight the fact that they had a lot of say in the way the project looks, but also in the theorizing of the project and what construct we privilege every semester when we focus on motivation with them. The second guiding question is, how do students engage in scholastic activities that provide opportunities to fulfill communal goals? And so here we're looking at their ratings of different activities and how it connects with their patterns of engagement over the course of a unit. And finally, we know that students are not experts in electrical and computer engineering, right? So with this in mind, the reasons why they might engage in these activities might not always be obvious to them. So with this in mind, we also wanted to understand what is the teacher's role in scaffolding students' appreciation for what is taught, right? Jerry Brophy talks about this idea of taking students over the motivational zone of proximal development. And so we really wanted to unpack that for ourselves, because within the meta-narrative of utility value research interventions that have been done time and time again, the role of the teacher and the role of the curriculum is not necessarily always privileged. So what can we learn from these teachers? So regarding teachers' voices being reflected, what we did was we first brought teachers to North Carolina State University for a professional development at the beginning of the semester. And these are teachers from 2 schools who are participating in the iScholar project. And so it's about 15 teachers overall. And so rather than presenting research to them and them rolling their eyes, right? Or it's North Carolina, so they're very polite, right? So they'll act like they're paying attention and nod their heads, but they can't wait to talk about how dry this presentation was. So instead what we do is we provide these cards. They're like research nuggets, and they contain little nuggets of research. We say, you sort through the cards. Make a pile of the ones that are useful for you and the ones that you just don't really appreciate at all. But and make a pile of the ones that you disagree with, right? Because we want you to really engage with these ideas. And so out of this comes a very rich discussion among teachers and us, and we get to see what matters to them, and we get the theory across to teachers before we engage in instructional strategies. So what I'm about to play now is just a quick clip of a teacher reacting to this particular research nugget, and then I'll play it now.
Including what is taught in school is worth learning for at least one good reason. but this is not necessarily the case because, like I said, Black history, African history is not taught in our curriculum. We have to seek it out. Or Hispanic culture and history and accomplishments, that's not taught. We have to seek it out. But the dominant culture and history is taught, but it's not necessarily the only one that is worth teaching.
Right.
This teacher's comments remind me of the past president of AERA, Joyce King, and some ideas that she mentioned. One of which is this idea that schools rest on a cultural platform that mirrors society at large. And so whether we acknowledge it or not, culture is always present. But by not acknowledging it, we run the risk of devaluing individuals who are positioned in a very vulnerable spot next to the majority culture. And so with this in mind, she mentions that it's important to provide opportunities for students to feel that their culture is affirmed inside of schools. However, there's another piece of this as well. We also need to remember where certain ideas come from. But so by just reminding ourselves of where our ideas come from, certain ideas that we actually promote, sometimes they're already culturally relevant. One of which is this idea of communalism. Dr. Wade Boykin at Howard University, he's been talking about this for decades. And it's this idea of privileging the group over the self. And so by remembering this idea of communalism, we take this idea of communalism that has already been published in the Journal of Educational Psychology, and we say, hey, look, this is actually something that is culturally relevant. Just because it works for everybody, doesn't mean it's not culturally relevant, right? And it can't affirm students of color. So there are additional reasons why we should think about this concept as meaningful for our students in Durham, North Carolina. Here's another clip.
Possible to do things we see those examples are.
You want to go?
I'll let you go.
Okay. I'll choose one that I chose some of the same ones, but when teachers have difficulty seeing the value in academic materials, it's hard for them to convince students why they should learn the material. And I think I struggled with that more last year than ever, because I felt trapped at times, like, oh, do I have to teach it like this? Do I have to teach this? And I think it's that intricate struggle between being creative, and trying to color within the lines of education. But also, we're in the classroom, we know what works. We know what the kids need to hear. And I think taking that freedom and saying, no, I'm going to teach what they need. I'm gonna do, follow a common core, but I'm gonna teach what they need. And I think this year I feel a lot more empowered to do that. And so I think it's important to, if I feel passionate about it, like I'm not just teaching this because, and we do have to do that, right, to some degree. But I think this year I'm planning to do it less. And really teach what I'm passionate about teaching.
I wish we had more time to unpack this quote as a group. But can one person just share your thoughts about what this teacher's comments made you think about? Yes, what's your name?
Liana.
Hi, Liana.
It made me think about the difficult spot that we put teachers in every day to try to tell them what they are supposed to teach our young people when they're the ones who are interacting with them, who know them, who know their families, who know their community, we hope, and why we can't be better about trusting their knowledge of themselves and their students.
Yeah, trusting their knowledge is so important, but regardless of if we trust it or if we're not, what is clear from this quote, the teacher still has the power at the end of the day. Because you can teach something and then you can really teach something, right? So this idea that a teacher might just cover the information, because it's supposed to be covered, I can do that, but I can spend more of my time over here because I understand what the students really need. So they have agency that they can express, and this quote is kind of evidence of that idea. So it's important to acknowledge that. So we want to include their voices and perspectives and think about what that means for designing curricula that could be used in career and technical education courses in STEM, but also an after-school environment. So this project began all in after school, and for important reasons, it had been taken from after school into school environments. And it was because teachers actually liked the content that was covered. They had a role or say in the curriculum, and they pretty much demanded at one of the schools that the principal allow them to teach this in their elective STEM courses. So I'm going to talk a little bit about curricular activities as opportunities for communal utility value. So what we are doing is we're collaborating with teachers to think about ways in which students can contribute substantively to the social and physical conditions in which they live. And so that's the point of the activity. That's foregrounded. Electrical and computer engineering activities are in the background. And all of the lessons pretty much touch on these ideas and give a point or a why, right? So rather than focusing on this idea of STEM awareness, we're focusing on this idea of STEM wokeness, right? And so with this in mind, teachers have really been engaged in this process. But what we're learning from students is that when students understand when, where, and why academic content is useful for serving their community, serving humanity, and serving others, they engage a little more. This is important because at the end of the day, as the quote illustrates, teachers do have a say. But it also talks about the role of including teachers up front in the development of curriculum and how important and essential that is to use their on-the-ground knowledge to build a curriculum that actually fits and meets the needs of students. So what you're seeing today is a subsample of individuals, 98 sixth graders. The reason why it's a subsample is because, as I mentioned previously, the lessons were going so well at one school that the teacher said, why are we doing this after school? To make sure that this is really this really matters and impacts students, let's move this to the school day. Students can elect to take this course. And frankly, from a practical perspective, the teachers, they were already stretched thin, right? So it makes it easier for them to embed this and incorporate this into the school day. And it was a low stakes, low risk environment because it's not like a course where students are tested on this subject, right? So it's the perfect testing bed to try out some of these ideas in schools. And importantly, we did tell NSF that we would continue to try to learn about strategies that responded to the needs of these schools. And so being agile was a part of our research design. Here is a sample of an exit ticket that students completed. They completed this once a week after every lesson. There were 6 lessons overall, right? So what we see here is that today's lesson connected to problems in my community, showed me how my actions can protect the lives of humans, plants, and animals, and was important for learning how to help other people. These represent different facets or aspects of communal utility value. And because Elizabeth Brown had talked about the ways in which communal utility value can be used differentially to predict students' motivation, we decided to use these as single items here. Let's see if they differentially predicted our outcome of interest, which was behavioral engagement, which has to do with the extent to which students are really paying attention, participating in class, etc. So what you're looking at here is a graph where on the x-axis you have the time since teachers attended our initial workshop at NC State. And on the y-axis you have students' reports of their own behavioral engagement, which went from 1 to 6. So one question that could be asked is, over time, do students go up and up and up in their engagement when their teachers have attended this professional development and learned about instructional strategies for conveying the communal purposes of what they were learning, right? The answer is no, right? There is not a significant increase in engagement over time in this small sample. We're building out, so we'll have a larger sample in the spring, but there's not. But that's not the end of the story, fortunately, because we were interested in what's called time-varying covariance, right? The extent to which their perceptions of communal utility value related to their engagement patterns over time, because this is an overall trajectory, right? An average trajectory. This doesn't necessarily capture each individual's trajectory, right? So we wanted to know, whether or not it just over time, even within an individual, if there are fluctuations from week to week, is that associated, or can be traced back to perception of communal utility value. We ran a growth curve model, and what's important to know is, just for the sake of right now, I included this for those who care about all of these predictors, but I'm focusing on the three that have to do with communal utility value for now. What I'm going to show you is their perceptions of serving the community and how much it's related to their dips and spikes in behavior engagement. So what you see here, you're going to see these little things pop up, right? These represent, day-to-day kind of spikes or increases that you can expect on days where students rated activities as more relevant for serving their community. And what we see is that these spikes could have been on any given day. I just chose 3 and 7 because they're far enough apart for me to put arrows in between. And the effect was non-significant. Oh, right? But that's not the end of the story because we still have 2 more, right? So what we found was on days in which students rated their activities as more relevant to preserving different forms of life, like plants, animals, and other humans, there was a significant spike in their engagement on those days. And the same goes for their perceptions of how much the activities really position them and show them how they can serve one another. Right? So, the takeaway here, there are a couple. The first is that overall perceptions of value are sometimes studied, like how much do I value learning about mathematics? How much do I value learning about computer engineering, for example, right? But these are not specific tasks, right? There are also specific tasks that we can do inside of classrooms, and there might be fluctuations there. Students might, not necessarily be as motivated to engage on one task or another, but what explains these fluctuations in values partially is the extent to which tasks are relevant for serving humanity and serving others. So we also learned that different forms of communal utility value are effective or not. And so what we did was we brought teachers to NC State, so rather than waiting till this information is published and hoping that our pre-service teachers read this someday, which by then they'll probably be gone and in the field and graduated, we wanted to bring it to them fresh and also affirm our teachers. So we brought them in for a panel discussion on this, and one of my undergraduates, she went through our, we do consultations at the beginning and the end of each semester and we record them. So she listened to the consultations and came up with questions that she wanted to ask students, or the teachers, and that the students could chime in on as well. So these teachers are having conversations about this notion of serving the community and what it means. I found this particularly interesting for helping us think about why those effects might not be significant.
It depends on the student. It did depend on the student. I feel like although our Black students were more so like family, and our Latino students have more of a community outside of their family in their house because they have stores and restaurants, that they would go to in the community that's their community. So whatever, that store or church is, it's usually the Latino students are going to that same place. So they are just all, more of one community than I think our Black kids.
Well, personally, I found that it didn't matter. It mattered on the child, right? Because you had some students, I know personally, there's a student who definitely does not consider her family, and she's Latino, she's Latina, and her friends are her family. Okay, the same thing with African. There's a girl I know personally, African American. Her friends are her family. She doesn't want to have anything to do with her family. So it depends on their story. It changes. You know what I mean? That's what I found to be true.
Well, what our team took away from this discussion is that the term community meant so much more to students than it actually meant to the teachers in the PD or even to us. And so with this in mind, a term that might have been more useful for what we were trying to capture might be neighborhood. And there are other forms of communal utility value that also can fit under this idea of community. So there's a lot of room there for the development of additional measures or studies and follow-ups to like capture that nuance. But also, we just want to underscore the importance of developing students' appreciation for what is taught as being like connected to curriculum and activities that students are actually doing inside of classrooms, and say that maybe there could be room inside a rubric or a template for developing curriculum that actually like provides opportunities for teachers to think about this communal relevance up front. But importantly, as the teacher mentioned earlier, this teacher, I don't think it was a lack of content knowledge that allowed him not to see the relevance. Some things just don't always have a point that we can see, right? I'm sure they have a point to people who came up with ideas to include them in the curriculum, but they don't always like have a point. So even beyond just our project, what does it mean to like convey the point or the purposes for those who currently make curricula across the board? So now I want to talk about strategies that have to do with instructional opportunities. So what we did as well was when we brought teachers to NC State, rather than providing them with instructional strategies, it was a working PD where the whole time together we spent time outlining strategies in the context of these lessons that they had co-constructed. So the trade-off was by helping collaborate on the lessons, that freed up some of their thinking time, so there was time within the PD to really focus on instructional strategies, because the big idea with NSF was they were skeptical of us getting the money and trying to bring them in and do everything in one PD and not being able to accomplish that. So a way to kind of lift, some of the burden off of teachers is just to take something off their plate a little bit, and we put the finishing touches on the activities that the students did. But of course, teachers have say in how this looks in their classroom. But the trade-off was it freed up their time to really focus on instructional strategies in the PD. What we're learning here is that instruction is so dynamic and student interactions matter so much for instruction that one classroom to the next, things shouldn't necessarily look the same. So observing over time really gives us a sense for a teacher's trajectory of supporting students' motivation in a way that can't be necessarily captured in one snapshot all the time. And this is important to consider because based on like a teacher's philosophy around what it means to motivate a student, this will dictate certain strategy. But I mean, sometimes there's a rhyme and reason to how a teacher is doing things that might not necessarily be apparent at the start always. So what we did was we involved teachers in the development of the protocol. One reason why is because we didn't want them to think that this protocol was not supposed to be culturally relevant and supporting them, and also like just acknowledging what they already knew and brought to the table. The second is we asked retired teachers with over combined 25 years of experience to come in and do the observations instead of us doing, right? Or training graduate students doing, or me doing them myself. And what this did was really create room for the partnership. So while the teacher was teaching, I might be in the back, like kind of like working on materials, getting that together to help and support the teacher. If the teacher has a real demand placed on them, like they haven't eaten yet today, they might go in the back and scarf down the sandwich, and I'm just kind of passing out things to get started, right? But it really created a sense of trust and vulnerability there, where it's not my role to teach the class, but in educational psychology, we tend to distance ourselves from the data, or even from interventions, and say, okay, we said it, okay, it should work when we, put it in place. Or this idea of fidelity of implementation. I really wanted to rethink that and what that means for the trust that teachers have and what how they express vulnerability essentially. And so this allowed me to learn so much more. And so I was there, video, taking the videos in every lesson, and just spending time in the schools. There were 6 times that each teacher was observed for 45 minutes each. That was how long the elective period was. And finally, we had follow-up consultations with teachers just to get their perspective on things. So I'm just going to try to weave some of that together for us. And so these are the lessons that students engaged in. And so I'm going to talk about the observations in the context of these lessons using 2 teachers as examples. This first teacher, Mr. Felton, I want to introduce you to him a little bit by giving you an idea of his philosophy, and then we're going to take you into his class to see how he supported students' opportunities to think about how they can serve humanity.
if we can really teach like innovation from our lens and how it builds and can benefit our communities. I think once we start to say, oh, and then we have people like Einstein, and then we have people like, I just looked at Tesla, those type of people. The kids are like, man, that stuff is not natural to us. So we don't want to hear it. We don't want to hear it at all. So I think if we can just get our own space, we can start to develop a new idea of what innovation. Our ancestors really showed us what innovation looked like. We just
So at the end he said our ancestors literally showed us what innovation looks like, we just screwed it up. And so that's important to understand because his whole philosophy has to do with this idea of going mining for tools, to use one of my friend's phrases, in history, because the answers to how we need to support our students lie with our ancestors. So what does this look like for him in the context of his classroom? And what you're looking at here, this is called a state space grid. And so it's a two-dimensional space that you can use to think about ways of like looking at things like teacher-student interactions, for example. But it can be used for anything, right? But on the x-axis here, we have the observers' ratings of how much teachers were emphasizing this idea of serving humanity. On the y-axis, we have their ratings of how much students were focused, paying attention, not being distracted or disruptive in the classroom. This yellow box is something that we are conceptualizing as the ideal zone that we would like for teachers to be in, right? So is there at least some evidence? Because, you know, this idea of conveying the communal purposes of what students are learning, this can be new for some teachers, right? And it was certainly new to a lot of our students because they emphasized that in their elementary school classroom, they had never really covered this or thought about it, actually. And so with this in mind, if some evidence was shown, that was important enough for us to think about how does that connect with students' engagement patterns, and how do these things relate dynamically over time and not just in a linear way. What are some non-linear ways in which these things play out? So in the first lesson, students were really focusing on this idea of how do we use available resources, you know, that are available to us right now to build something that matters for our community, right? They learned about the gentleman who built a windmill farm in Mawali. So here you see that the teacher knocks it out of the park early, right? What was he doing in that classroom? And here's what our observers said. So after our observers observed, what they did was I would meet with them at the end. I say, could you tell me a little bit about, you know, what you saw in the class today? Okay, what ratings did you choose? Why did you choose those ratings? So I engaged in cognitive interviewing with them just to see why they were choosing the ratings that they chose. So here's what one of our observers said about this classroom.
So I really saw what a 3 looks like today. So it was awesome. The students were actively engaged. I mean, they were just, it was more than just answering questions. They were really, you can tell they were really into the video. There was actually one student in there that actually read the book about the young man way before this. So he was actually able to tell everything about the story. I'm like, hold on, you didn't even see the video yet. So it was, that was awesome. The teacher also consistently asked why questions when students were just answering 1 or 2 words. So that prompted students to think deeper and really foster those critical thinking skills, because they had to think deeper. They had to actually explain what it is that they were trying to say, and it also led to discussion among students. The teacher wasn't even saying anything, the students were actually talking about themselves, so they got a 3 for that.
He wasn't just asking any why question. He was asking, why is this important for helping you think about how you can preserve different forms of life in the places that you live or find yourself. What's also important about that, I was in this class and the PowerPoint wasn't working. So that's how we found out the book that was even in the student's book bag. PowerPoint wasn't working, he was clicking and the student said, hey, is this about the guy in Africa? Oh, I know all about that. He just kind of like, just gave the whole like premise of the book, just a 5-minute spiel, and just covered it all, and he pulled the book out of his book bag. So, I mean, you can't make that up, and it just shows the power of really engaging students in a way that kind of like fits with the life that they engage in at home and what really matters to them. The second lesson was all about technical assistance. What we're learning is that you can't always engage in the, you could make space for the communal purposes in every lesson. But sometimes, you know, you got to get down to business and really get like, so his first lesson, he was supposed to engage in like, you know, an activity and build windmills, but they never got there. It was all about the discussion. But what I learned from him is, you know, I was really kind of upset when I left that class because they didn't do anything, according to me, right? But what I learned was sometimes it's important to just like make sure that students' heads are screwed on straight and they understand what they're doing and why. Sometimes he wouldn't start a lesson before students really understood like what the point was. If they weren't, he didn't start. And so I used to always think that was a strategy to stall because the teacher wasn't prepared. But you know, he showed me otherwise. And then the third lesson, he really emphasized communalism as a value, right? He said you need to feel like you're responsible for others. Here's what students took away from this discussion in focus groups at the end of the semester.
Trying to do your own things, trying to create ideas. Like say you're sitting around, you have nothing to do, just bored, like start trying to try out ideas of what you can possibly do for later that can help your environment. Like simple things. Oh, sorry.
What he said was like, don't, what helped me, like, he didn't say it the same way, but how he said it, in my mind it sound like, don't depend on other people, don't like wait on nobody else, do it yourself if you're really like into it.
Simple things like going to the community, if it's just picking up the trash.
As we see here, communalism is not only something that we can just emphasize as, you know, these are the communal benefits. Teachers actually always, we know teachers have a role in, you know, transmitting values and what's important. And so this is one value that students might not always have. What we saw was there was a clear elevation in these students kind of understanding that communalism and like being other focused has merits, right? You know, and that part of that, his work for him was convincing students that there are benefits to thinking about things outside of just yourself. More technical assistance followed by more question-driven pedagogy. Now, I want to show you one more teacher. I'll be swift. So this is not the teacher, but Miss Elcock in her classroom, she had a different pattern of engaging students and helping them think about how they can serve one another. Here's her philosophy.
And so we kind of have to start with where the students are and motivate them, and it may not seem like we're really challenging students, but using that as leverage to then push them to do the things that you want them to do. Not that we want to trick the children, but kind of, you know, starting with the conversations about the shoes and then putting in like engineering, and before you know it, they're doing these things that they thought they had no interest in, but we have to first find that interest for them to then.
So she was about meeting students where they are, right? And she said, you know, a lot of students want to have fun, so let's let them have fun first. So unlike Mr. Felton's class where they started off really focused on the why, she just let them just go for it and just build the windmills out of stuff. They built amazing things in this windmill challenge, you know, but I was sitting there like, they don't know why they're doing this. This doesn't have a point, right? So I walked out of that class like, this is, I don't know what's going on this semester. I think it's a wash and I'm wasting my time, right? So then on the second day, this day was also a wash. So like there were a lot of fights that broke out at the school. And she's on the STEM wing, so her office is like right at the front of the wing. So she's the first responder who runs out always to just say, hey, what's going on? So she tried to really focus on this idea of locating students by positioning their culture at the center of what was going on in the lesson. And this lesson was about like conducting a needs assessment as an engineer. Before you build something, you need to understand like what you're building on. Is this land sacred? Like who cares about like what is there and why it's there? What's the tradition, right? You know, because if we don't take that into account, then it's dangerous. But it was a flop, right? Completely. But she bounced back. She learned from this lesson and she came back like a lot stronger. And here's what the students said about this third lesson on this idea of creating a tiny house, which connects to a lot of issues in Durham right now. and community and like Section 8 housing. Do you remember any times during the semester in design and modeling where you and your classmates really paid attention, weren't distracted, were really focused, and actually trying to do the activity?
Of the tiny house project. I would say it was,
Everyone.
everybody was like doing this. We was all like collaborating. We kept on asking for ideas for some of the stuff. And some people told them what they should do and how should they do it. People was helping each other. It was all interactive. It was like we all did everything, but we did it like separately. So like it was a group work, but we built it by ourselves.
Well, what was important about, let me show you one thing. This is the front of her classroom, what it looked like. The reason why this lesson was effective and what students said was they really got an opportunity to learn from their peers during this lesson, because she stopped everything and she said, hey look, we're going to use data to talk about issues of discrimination and housing in the community, but we're also going to say, how do you feel like treated within this school, right? So she paused and had a whole like segment on this idea of belonging, and had students of different ethnicities talking about the ways that they feel treated poorly because of their race. And she said, okay, well, when you're working on this project is highly technical. You like the most important skill in building something like this is not like what you build, it's learning how to communicate with other people and sweat it out with these other people who have differences, right? So that was like a big teaching moment and nugget, and that like led to more harmony and unity within the lesson. Then she went on to technical assistance, followed by another like small lesson on how to locate their students when it came to a lesson about sneakers and going to Mars and designing shoes that matter. So they wouldn't have to wear like, you know, really Bobo astronaut looking shoes on their feet. And finally, the last lesson was all about technical assistance. And so here are the takeaways. One is developing students' appreciation for what is taught involves both lesson framing and student discovery. So like you can frame a lesson in Mr. Felton's case, and that's important. But another strategy also involves like responding to their engagement patterns and adapting and shifting and being dynamic and flexible as a teacher to say, based on what they're giving me, how can I use what they're giving me to lean into that a little more to come up with a strategy that really kind of fits and like creates the aha moment for them, right? There also are good reasons why instructional strategy use isn't always stable in the classroom. You know, schools are highly complex and classrooms are highly complex. And you're not going to get the same things every day. So the strategy that we think about with teachers also could be considered on a trajectory of sorts as well, to think about like what is the follow-up? Where in a lesson might this strategy be appropriate within a unit, you know, and where might it not be appropriate in a unit? And finally, engagement shapes instructional opportunities as well. So students shape teachers just as much as teachers are shaping students for the sake of communal utility values specifically. And so, in closing, I just want to close by sharing my thinking about things. I think now more than ever, we're in a time where there are a lot of practical challenges for educators, but educational psychologists in particular, in conveying the relevance and meaning of our work. And so, like, the next wave of this, for me, is going to involve a consideration of culture, of content, of instructional context, and of like just a larger or broader climate and society that students find themselves in, because it's important to understand how students are positioned relative to different policies in school and in society. And this will be the key to having a more race re-imaged and colorful view of educational psychology moving forward. So, thank you.
We can take a few questions.
Yes, sir. What's your name?
Neil Jacobson. Nice to meet you. Great talk. I'm just interested in kind of the baseline, or kind of at a descriptive level. Has the research indicated that all individuals are equally amenable to a communalistic framing or approach?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So it goes back to a more fundamental question. Did we ask students, how communally focused are you? that is an important question, but it doesn't really capture our larger point. You know, our point is about opportunity structures in schools, right? And so I guess one question is like, did it hurt anybody? You know, would be, you know, one question to focus. And what one teacher was saying is, on some days she had to like really tell students what was in it for them, right? You know, if you focus on this tiny house lesson and build things that are meaningful for you, you can like present this at NC State and have a larger stage to share out and communicate your ideas, right? Another example of this was a teacher saying, okay, tiny houses are important to address issues of homelessness because we have more Section 8 vouchers than we have places for people to live in Durham, North Carolina. So tiny houses was the why behind that lesson, right? But some people say, this doesn't really reflect me. I got like, you know, 8 people in my household, you know, a tiny house won't work. She said, build a mansion, right? You know, so she like adapted and said, you know what, it's not always going to be one particular motivation strategy. So I don't want us to walk away thinking that this is the only piece of a supportive motivational climate for students, because we know that several things matter, including Erica's work on autonomy support kind of teaches us that, you know, very well. But at the same time, I want to say that, you know, I talked about this a little bit at my school, and I said a little communalism never hurt anybody, right? That's really what I thought about changing the talk to, you know, because that's the larger point is we can like hold different values, but at the end of the day, what does it mean to be in a structure that provides us the opportunity to think about others? You know, it's not necessarily going to hurt us. So even if it doesn't like help everybody the same, it's not going to hurt. You know? Yes.
And also, if we've seen kind of consistently in the literature that communalism is a strength of African American culture, that it's a strength of, you know, Latino culture, then I don't know if you need to sort of, you know, survey students or ask students about this thing that's been, you know, consistently found in.
Right, because you see it like in community building, you see it in churches, you see it in like organizing, like, you know, in rallies, you know, you see it in Kwanzaa,
right?
You know, in several other areas of African American life, it's present. So I think, you know, it could be an assumption, but even if you bypass the assumption and go back to Elizabeth Brown's work, it's still good for people who aren't even black, right? Yep.
Question. So, I mean, when you're looking at the photographs, getting a sense of like what these craft classrooms look like, am I right in assuming that most of the teachers are black, maybe they're brown, and the kids are mostly black and brown, clearly?
Yeah.
So, I guess what I'm wondering is that, you know, like, if you are a black teacher, you probably do come with this assumption that communalism is a good thing. You don't have to kind of get over that barrier that, you know, like learning is about kind of individual learning and whatever. So I guess what I'm just sort of imagining in a more practical sense is like, how would the studies that you're doing through this grant work in a classroom that is a white teacher with mostly black and brown students, like you might find in Los Angeles, New York, Chicago, and if you've given any sort of thought to that?
Yes, so we have white teachers in our project as well. Okay. Few of them, but they're really good at thinking about ways that support students that are unique to them, right? So the way communalism is expressed is going to be like different from person to person, right? You know, because we bring our own realities and stories into the teaching profession or anything that we do. So what I heard on a panel where these other teachers were having a conversation, that was a black and brown you know, group dyad having a conversation, but a white male was on the panel as well. He's a teacher. He said, you know, I really try to make sure that I've tried this myself before I go in and teach it to students, because for me, that helps me feel like I'm confident in knowing what I'm doing. And so, you know, it's a learning opportunity for the teacher to learn from their students. So there are multiple ways of knowing. Students bring in knowledge into the classroom. So even if you don't have access to that knowledge, you can be genuinely curious in understanding things. Our perfect example, in our first semester we had this lesson called Program Appear, where students learn how to code by programming popular dances like the Nene, for example, right? So they said that's not how you do the Nene, right? So the teacher was trying to do it, and he's a white teacher trying to do the Nene, and he's struggling, but they have to program him to do it, and so their culture is privileged, and now he's backdooring the conversation on like how this idea of a recipe for this is the same thing that you need to understand what coding is, when it comes to computer science. So in that sense, like when teachers see students as individuals who allow them to learn, right? Their content and their culture that they bring with them into the school matters, and you can use that and harness that in the classroom. So that's what the teachers who are white are learning the most. Yes.
Hi, Pat Toby, faculty. I'm wondering, it would be interesting in a longitudinal study with this approach that you're using, or that your study is using, in their developmental learning, and how now will they approach in their next classes, right? Having learned this framework or expressed it.
So that is where we are thinking as well. So what we did was we said we need to build trust at the school first, right? There are good reasons why students of color and their teachers at these predominantly black schools would not trust a university, right? Our sample size is starting to increase as we get more and more access. So instead of being just in the CTE classrooms that have 98 students and just only 6th graders, we're going to be in all of them this spring, right? And so we also have agreement from the principal to get data on whatever students are involved in the project. What happens after students leave if they're in 8th grade going on to 9th grade? I'm not really, sure how we'll continue to track that through the district, but in the short term we'll have that. And in the fall, like the class that we taught in the fall was a semester-long CTE class. So at least with next year with a larger sample, we might be able to see what is happening not only with their engagement and their performance in classrooms, but also what's going on with their attendance and disciplinary referrals, etc. As a function of this as well. So thank you for that.
Excellent.
Well, thanks so much.
Thank you.